There we go. Welcome, everyone. I am super excited to host Dr. Jean Gordon from University of Iowa today as an ongoing part of our Focus Aphasia interactive events. Thanks very much to Jean for being here and chatting with us. I'll let her introduce herself in a bit more detail, but I wanted to give just a few announcements. We've got a two-part workshop coming up with Dr. Julie Hangst, and then we've got an early career researcher who's going to talk to us about her project. That's Carla Chinoweth. She's been working on the Luna project, which is ongoing over in the UK. So some exciting events coming up as well. As you know, we post everything on YouTube afterwards, so feel free to check those out, and they're also archived on the website. If you want a letter of attendance marking your attendance here today, I know a lot of the state associations are requiring the letters for kind of ongoing licensure, and they have to be live events. So if you need that, I've put my contact information in the chat, so just feel free to email me after, and I'm happy to get that to you. Welcome to keep your videos on. I generally turn mine off just because my Wi-Fi is a little questionable sometimes and it reduces my bandwidth, but you're welcome to keep them on or off. I think that is all of my announcements. So with that, I will turn it over to our talk by Dr. Gordon. Thanks very much for being here.
Thanks, Bree. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jean Gordon, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Iowa, where I've been for 20 years, give or take. And my main area of research is language production in aphasia and in typical aging. And so I study, the two main topics are fluency in those populations and word retrieval. So I'm going to talk today about my COVID baby. So this was when we shut down last spring. I was stuck at home with a big pile of data, and so this was a great project to do. I had previously done a couple of projects looking at predictors of fluency with my colleague, Cherise Clough, who I think is here today. And that was a different project than the one I'm presenting today. That was specifically looking at predictors of fluency, whereas the factor analysis is a little more agnostic in where the goal is to try to identify what are the important factors of spontaneous speech. But in the process of publishing those two papers with Cherise on fluency, we had one of our reviewers who was pretty adamant that we should be doing a factor analysis. And so that was one of the motivators behind this project. So the project was, other than that, was motivated by the idea that spontaneous speech is really the gold standard for understanding aphasia. The syndromes of aphasia vary most on dimensions of spontaneous speech, and it's also the most ecologically valid outcome. So what we really want to know is how individuals with aphasia can perform in connected speech tasks. Because of the complexity of spontaneous speech, that's one of the things that actually makes it highly ecologically valid, because structured tasks like naming and repetition don't really represent the type of difficulty that somebody might have when they have to generate words and combine them into sentences and superimpose the prosodic contour, phonologically encode it, and all those things that interact during connected speech. But the complexity of spontaneous speech also creates problems. There are so many dimensions that are involved that it means that there's huge amount of variability in performance on connected speech tasks, not just across aphasia subtypes, which is diagnostically helpful, but also within aphasia subtypes. And that variability within subtypes is one of the origin really of one of the other motivators for this task, the idea that classic aphasia syndromes have been criticized justifiably for their variability. The fact that these categories are very fuzzy, they've been described as, having fuzzy boundaries, meaning the characteristics overlap a lot, and there's as much variability within a syndrome as across syndromes. And that creates problems for really the conceptual validity of the categories and using them to predict things like neural substrates. So one of the other goals then is to see if there's a more objective basis for classification based on patterns of spontaneous speech. So there have been previous factor analyses done in the literature, and many of these were conducted as a way of assessing the validity of comprehensive aphasia batteries as they were being developed. So one example is, I think in the second version of the Boston Diagnostic Aphasia Exam, Goodglass and Kaplan conducted a factor analysis and identified 7 factors that broke down by 7 factors by modality. So when factor analyses are based on a wide range of language tasks that cross modalities, the factors do tend to break down by modality, as this one did: auditory comprehension, reading, writing, and then there are usually additional factors within the modality of spoken language, because there's so much variability within that modality. So this one broke down into repetition, fluency, oral agility, and paraphasia. So we're most interested then in factor analyses that specifically look at spontaneous speech. How does that break down? And there have been others that restricted the analysis to spoken language production, but factor analyses have fairly rigid criteria. And so many of the previous studies were limited in that they had too few subjects or too few variables to really represent the range of variance in spontaneous speech. Another problem of previous research has been the reliance on ratings. So rating scales are subject to subjectivity. They can be subjective measures, although I have to say that this study by Casilio and colleagues, so a Stephen Wilson study, they did a really nice job of establishing that the ratings were reliable. And ratings, I've used ratings before, they can be, with sufficient training, they can be certainly made to be more reliable. But one of the other problems that I've also experienced in my research when I use rating scales is the problem of halo effects. So when you're trying to identify different dimensions, this can be a problem because halo effects means that when you rate somebody at a certain level on one scale, that tends to bleed into how you rate them on other scales. And so it becomes more difficult to separate out distinct dimensions. So we wanted to address some of these limitations in the current study by identifying factors underlying spontaneous speech in aphasia using a wide range of objectively measured microlinguistic measures. So I want to acknowledge some of the limitations of my own study up front. We did only focus on microlinguistic measures, no macrolinguistic measures like coherence and cohesion of discourse. And we were able to do this in a large and representative sample of individuals with aphasia. And the goal was, a second goal was to investigate the relationship of the factors that we identified to traditionally defined aphasia subtypes. And we used 2 methods for doing this: a supervised classification method, which was linear discriminant analysis, and then an unsupervised method, which was latent profile analysis. And I'll explain these a little more once I get to them. So this study was made possible by the fantastic resource that is Aphasia Bank. And we wanted to include as many of the individuals, of the English-speaking individuals with aphasia as we could. So at the time that we pulled the data out of Aphasia Bank, there were 307 unique individuals with aphasia. And we excluded one person for whom English was not their first or dominant language, 8 people who did not complete the Cinderella story retelling task that we were using, and another 24 who did not produce enough spontaneous speech in that task. So we ended up with this sample: 85 individuals with anomia, 88 with Broca's aphasia, anomic aphasia, 88 with Broca's aphasia, 42 with conduction aphasia, 11 transcortical motor aphasia, 20 Wernicke's aphasia, and 28 individuals classified as not aphasic by Western Aphasia Battery Scores, or NABW. So these are people who scored above the, I always forget, I think it's 96.8 WAB-AQ score that technically, according to that test, means that they have no residual aphasia, but of course it's been established by Davida Fromm and others that they do have remaining difficulties, especially in spontaneous speech. This group ranged in aphasia quotient, their severity level, from 13 to 99 with a median of 75, and ranged in time post onset from 1 month to 30 years with a median of 4 years. So a fairly diverse group. One thing I should mention about the sample, which is another limitation, is that you'll note there's nobody with global aphasia. And in fact, the people with more severe Broca's aphasia most of them were excluded for this reason. They did not produce at least 3 spontaneous utterances. And so it is a little bit skewed towards the milder end. And that's an artifact of looking at spontaneous speech and needing a sufficient sample. So from Aphasia Bank, we gathered 19 microlinguistic variables that during the story retelling task, the Cinderella story retelling task, and we wanted a set of variables that really covered the gamut of the way in which spontaneous speech can vary. So we had 2 narrative level measures, total utterances and speech rate. We had a number of utterance level measures. So these are things that are measured at the level of the utterance, coded at the level of the utterance, or they describe a characteristic of utterances like mean length of utterance. And 10 word level measures, including, if people don't know what this is a moving average type token ratio, which is a measure of lexical diversity. So in addition to representing these 3 different levels, we also wanted to make sure that our measures represented 3 different types of functioning: grammatical formulation, lexical retrieval, and phonological formulation and implementation. And you'll see that some of these measures, like speech rate and total utterances, repairs, could represent any of these functions, or at least more than one of these functions. And in addition to representing different levels, different domains, these measures also represented different ways in which spontaneous speech can break down. So many of them represented accuracy, some specificity or diversity, some complexity, and some represented efficiency of production. So it was important for us to have a wide variety of types of breakdown represented. So we started out with these 19 variables, and in the process of generating the factor analysis, 2 of them fell out because they did not show sufficient relationship to the other variables. They showed what's referred to as poor factorability, and those were noun marking and semantic errors. So in all, we ended up with 17 that went into the analysis. And with the 17 variables, that gave us a subject to variable ratio of 16, which is sufficient for a factor analysis. The minimum is generally given as 5, and sometimes some people say 10. So this is how we addressed the previous problem of not enough subjects in the sample. Okay, so this is the first result I want to show you. It's nothing to do with the factor analysis yet. It's just it just shows how each of the 6 classical syndromes performed on average on these 17 variables. And of course, there's a lot of variability that's not represented in this graph. You'll see that later. But if you look at the different syndromes, you can see that they are distinguished from each other in predictable ways. So for example, if we look at these measures of overall fluency, speech rate, and MLU, you can see that the fluent categories are differentiated from the non-fluent categories here. Broca's in transcortical motor versus Wernicke's in pink, not aphasic biwab in green, conduction in red, and anomic in blue. And I keep this color coding throughout, so hopefully that'll make it easier to follow some of the graphs. Also, if you look at, this is a measure of circumlocution combined with empty speech, you can see that Wernicke's aphasia produces a lot of that's a characteristic of Wernicke's aphasia. Same with the measure of jargon compared to the other syndromes. Okay. So then we come to the factor analysis, and we made some very intentional decisions of the type of method we were going to use. We did a factor analysis rather than a principal components analysis, which was different from some of the previous research. And the main difference here is that the factor analysis only captures shared variance across the variables, whereas a principal components analysis attempts or does account for all the variance, including error variance or noise variance, which we were not interested in. So the goal of a factor analysis is really to identify underlying or latent factors that account for, that contribute to the variability in these overt speech measures that we included. It's not to partition up all the variance. And as Wilson and Hula have discussed in their paper, this is the appropriate method, factor analysis, when you're interested in the theoretical underlying factors. The other thing we did, which is different from most of the other research out there, is we used an oblique rotation rather than an orthogonal rotation. And the main difference here is that the oblique rotation does not assume that the components are going to be, that are identified, are going to be uncorrelated. Whereas an orthogonal rotation, that's what that means, is that the components are going to be separate from each other, not correlated. And I'm sure you all know that in measuring dimensions of spontaneous speech, there's a lot of intercorrelation. And so we wanted to allow that, allow the components to be correlated with each other, because we felt that was a better representation of reality. So here's the intercorrelation chart of all the variables that went into it. And for the most part, the intercorrelations are small to moderate. We didn't want to have a lot of redundant variables. But you can see that there were a couple of variables here that showed very low correlations with all the other variables. And these are the two that I mentioned earlier, semantic errors and noun marking. And because they're not correlated with any of the other variables, they did not contribute to the factor analysis, and that's why they were excluded. The criterion we used was no intercorrelations over 0.2. Okay, so the next problem in a factor analysis is to decide how many factors are appropriate. And there are lots of different criteria that can be used. One method is to use what's called a parallel analysis, which is what we did to generate this spree plot. And what that does is it compares the obtained eigenvalues for the different factors. And this is when all of them are included, to randomly, to eigenvalues that are generated by random resampling of the data. And so this red line represents randomly generated eigenvalues for factors, and the blue line represents what we obtained. So you can see that the first 6 are above that randomly generated line. So those are the ones that we kept. And the factor analysis generates 2 possible matrices of results. And I'm going to show you both of them, and then we're going to focus on one of them. So one is a pattern matrix, which basically shows the unique variance for each of the factors. Here are the factors that were generated here. And I'm going to explain them in the next slide. But these are the names that I gave them. You'll see why in a minute, hopefully. So this is the unique variance that's accounted for by each of the 6 factors, for a total of 52% of the variance in the spontaneous speech measures that we included. 52% of the variance was accounted for. The structure matrix shows the total variance accounted for by each factor, including any variance that overlaps between the factors. So that's why these numbers are higher, and they can't be added together because some of the variance that's accounted for here is overlaps between the factors, so would be double counted or triple counted. Okay, so the optimal solution, which was based on this parallel analysis, identifying 6 factors, but also on the interpretability of the factors, generated these 6 factors, which together accounted for 52% of the variance in the spontaneous speech measures. So here's what here's how the factors loaded on each of the original variables. So we have 2 matrices: the factor pattern matrix, which again shows the unique loadings, unique variance of each factor. So these are similar to partial correlations, but because we used an oblique rotation, they're not exactly partial correlations, and so they're not constrained. You can see here, they're not constrained to be less than 1, but don't let that throw you. They're similar to partial correlations. So if we look at this factor, we can see that what it loads on is utterance length, propositional density, which is the highest loading, content function ratio, some negative loadings on error production, type token ratio, grammatical errors, and bird marking. And I've put the highest loadings, those over 0.4, in bold, which, and these are the ones which most identify what this factor is representing. So I want to talk about this factor a little bit because it's maybe the least intuitive of all of them. I called it phrase building because it combines dimensions of lexical diversity, so the type token ratio here, propositional density, and what this measure is, it's a measure of the production of propositions, so ideas that are formed by combining words. And the way that it measures that is by counting words that combine with nouns. So it does not count nouns, but it counts words that combine with nouns to create ideas. So primarily verbs and adjectives. So the heavy loading of propositional density, type token ratio, and verb marking indicated to me that this really represents the ability to combine words to make ideas. So a basic level ability to make phrases. And it also correlates somewhat weakly, but with utterance length, and has a negative relationship with content function ratio. So phrase building is enhanced by being able to produce more function words relative to content words. Okay, most of the other factors are relatively straightforward. So grammatical complexity loaded onto utterance length, and our two measures of grammatical complexity, the extent to which the proportion of embedded clauses that occurred, and then complexity ratio was really a different way of measuring embedding in sentences. Next factor represents semantic anomalies with the heaviest loading on jargon production, but also unrelated word errors and neologistic errors. So in the previous versions of factor analyses that we conducted, semantic errors, which you remember were excluded as a measure, they did not load onto this factor, did not load with these variables. And that was somewhat surprising, but it illustrates that the production of semantically related errors is quite a different process than the production of semantically anomalous or unrelated errors, which are represented here. The next factor is grammatical error production, with the heaviest loading on our utterance level measure of grammatical errors, but also morphological errors and content function ratio and propositional density. The next factor is narrative productivity. So this is the ability to produce more words more quickly. So it loads onto total utterances and speech rate. And then the final factor is repairs, the retracing and repetition of utterances. And that's a measure in aphasia bank, so that's the heaviest loading there, but it's also negatively related to speech rate, indicating that more repairing slows you down. So just a technical note, the original variables are considered to be the behaviors that arise from the underlying hypothetical factors, these things that we identified. And so when we talk about them, we talk about phrase building, predicting, or loading onto utterance length rather than the other way around, because these are considered to be the underlying processes that give rise to these different behaviors. All right, so this is the factor pattern matrix, which is helpful to look at because the unique variance shared between the different factors and the underlying factors and the variables help identify these factors. This is the structure matrix. You can see a lot more loadings and cross loadings. Several variables like MLU cross load on all the factors. And that's because remember that this matrix represents total variance, not just unique variance. And so you're seeing all the overlapping variance between factors. And that illustrates that this first factor, as is often the case, is really to some extent represents severity, because it has associations with most of the original variables. Okay, so then what we did was generate factor scores for each individual. And factor scores are weighted estimates based on the scores that each participant got on the original variables and the association of each variable with the factor. And so for each individual, a score is generated on each factor based on all the different variables that contribute to it and how they did on those variables. So from here on in, we're only using the factor scores that were generated from the structure matrix, the one that allows for, that illustrates all the variance that's shared across factors. Okay, so each individual gets a score on every factor. What this graph is showing then is the average of the factor scores for each aphasia syndrome. So we get a profile of factor scores for each syndrome. And that you can see now that there's a lot of variability within the factor scores, on the factor scores within each syndrome, but you do see some characteristic patterns. So for example, in Broca's aphasia, we see the low scores on the so-called fluency measures. I meant to say, so let me just go back briefly. So I think one of the things that I think is a takeaway from these matrices is that there are really two levels of fluency. So what I'm calling phrase building is really a fluency at the basic phrase level, the ability to combine words into basic units. And then there's fluency at the narrative level, so the ability to put lots of words together and produce them relatively quickly. So here we see those two factors represented. The green is the phrase building, and then the blue is the narrative production. And the Broca's aphasia, individuals in the Broca's aphasia group are low on both of those. They're also low on the grammatical complexity measure that's shown here. And they're relatively high in the production of grammatical errors, the orange bar here. My cat always shows up at Zoom meetings. And here's transcortical motor aphasia, which has a similar profile in the low scores, the low fluency scores, phrase building and narrative production, but without the significant grammatical errors, the increase in grammatical errors, and without the very low scores on grammatical complexity. Conduction aphasia is characterized by more than average repairs. It doesn't have a very distinctive profile, conduction aphasia. It's one of the limitations of just looking at spontaneous speech to characterize the syndromes, but they did produce more repairs than average. There were only 2 of the syndromes that did that. Wernicke's aphasia, as you might expect, is characterized by high productivity, narrative productivity, but with a high degree of semantic anomaly shown in pink, but lots of variability there. And the lowest number of repairs, which is also not a surprise. They're not, often don't monitor well, and so they're not fixing their own errors. People with anomic aphasia, that was the other group, conduction and anomic, that showed a higher than average degree of repairs, and otherwise low on the error scores, the grammatical errors and the semantic anomalies, and above average on the phrase building. Not so high on narrative production. So that the fluency at this level is disrupted by making a lot of repairs. And the final category, not aphasic by lob, looks very similar in profile to the individuals with anomia, but better. So lower scores on the error dimensions, so fewer grammatical errors, fewer semantic anomalies, and higher scores on the other dimensions, higher grammatical complexity, higher phrase building, and higher narrative productivity, and fewer repairs as well. So eyeballing the syndromes shows fairly good correspondence to what we would expect from the classic syndrome labels, but lots and lots of variability across within the syndromes. So the next step then is to examine the correspondence between the factor scores in the syndromes statistically. And we did that with the linear discriminant analysis. So what a linear discriminant analysis does is it looks at the linear combination of variables that best predicts a certain outcome. And here, the variables we use, the input was the factor scores, the factor structure scores, and the output is the syndromes. So this is labeled a supervised classification technique because the outcome is predetermined, where unlike the next classification approach that we're going to talk about, here the outcome is already specified, and it's the syndrome. So how well do the factors predict the syndromes, or together, how well does a combination of the factors predict the syndromes? So this is what is generated from linear discriminant analysis. It shows the probability of each speaker belonging to the specified aphasia subtype. And so in this confusion matrix, you can see the correct classifications down the middle here on the diagonal, and on the off diagonals are the incorrect classifications. So just looking at the correct classifications, you can see that the most accurately classified groups were Broca's aphasia and anomic aphasia, 77 and 78% accurate, respectively. And these were the two largest groups, if you remember, 85 and 88 individuals in these groups. And so they were most accurately identified, but they were also over predicted. So the predicted, what the linear discriminant analysis classified was more than they actually were. So there were 88 individuals with Broca's aphasia, and the linear discriminant analysis found 91, which is over 100% of the number that actually were there. And so if you look at the off diagonals, you can see which types of aphasia were classified erroneously according to the clinical classifications into other, classified as Broca's aphasia. So transcortical motor, conduction aphasia, anomic aphasia were more likely to be classified as Broca's aphasia. And so again, looking back at the accuracy, you can see that transcortical motor aphasia was the least accurate. The linear discriminant model did not classify anyone with transcortical motor aphasia, and conduction aphasia was also very poor. Bottom square here shows overall classification accuracy. So out of all of the individuals, 61% were correctly classified by the linear discriminant analysis, which is not particularly high. So looking at some of the off diagonals, you can see that the most frequent error for Broca's aphasia was being classified as anomic aphasia, having anomic aphasia, and those with transcortical motor aphasia were most often classified as having Broca's aphasia or anomic aphasia. Those with conduction aphasia were most often classified as having anomic aphasia or Broca's aphasia. And those with Wernicke's aphasia, the most frequent error was conduction aphasia or anomic aphasia. You see a theme here. Anomic aphasia was the most common error was Broca's aphasia, and non-aphasic by Wabb, the most common error was anomic aphasia. So if you look across, you can see why these two large categories were over-predicted. And essentially what the model is doing is looking at the variance in the scores and seeing the dominant patterns of Broca's and anomic aphasia and over-predicting those. And so particularly anomic aphasia, which was 144% of the actual number were classified as anomic aphasia. And so it's almost like the model's treating this as like a default category. Okay, so then before we leave the linear discriminant analysis, I wanted to see how these misclassifications that we were just looking at compared to misclassifications of, compared to disagreements between clinicians. So I didn't tell you this before, but Aphasia Bank contains subtype diagnoses generated by two different means, generated from the Western Aphasia Battery scores and also generated from clinical judgments from the individuals who submitted the data or who tested the individuals by whatever means they typically use in the clinic. And looking at those two classifications, there were disagreements on 63 or 23% of the individuals in the set. And 55 of those involved comparable types of aphasia, as in the linear discriminant analysis. So I wanted to see how the distribution of clinical disagreements compared to the misclassifications in the linear discriminant analysis. And that's what's shown here. So the two pie charts show the confusions in the linear discriminant analysis and the disagreements by clinicians. And they're similar in many ways. So both of them tended to confuse anomic and Broca's categories. There were also some differences. So the model was more likely to confuse conduction and anomic aphasia compared to clinicians, and clinicians were more likely to confuse conduction and conduction and anomic in the model, and conduction and Broca's by clinicians. So there were some differences here, but many of the other types of confusions were similar across the two. Okay, so that brings us to the last classification method, a latent profile analysis. So maybe the problem of the linear discriminant analysis, the problem linear discriminant analysis had was trying to fit categories into these pre-existing fuzzy syndromes. So what about an unsupervised classification method where the categories of individuals are not constrained by some predefined outcome? So latent profile analysis is a kind of cluster analysis in which the nature and size of the groups is unknown or unassumed. So we didn't want to make any assumptions about the nature of the groups or how many belonged in each category. So this is quite comparable to conducting the factor analysis, but the difference is that here we're focusing on looking at the underlying shared variance among the individuals, where the factor analysis looks at underlying shared variance between the measures, the spontaneous speech measures. So now we're focusing on classifying individuals into broad categories. And to do that, the latent profile analysis can generate multiple models. Because we didn't want to make any assumptions ahead of time about the number of groups, we tested anywhere from 2 to 10 profiles, solutions with anywhere from 2 to 10 profiles, and making different assumptions about the variance and covariance of the data. And then all these model solutions were compared against each other by different criteria. And the best fit generated 7 profiles. So these were the different profiles on the factors. So, and I have given them labels that are based on the characteristics, the profile that they show on the different factors, as well as who went into it, which I'll show you next. So as you can see, the latent profiles capture some of the variability that is similar to the classical syndromes, but with some important differences. So the first profile is probably an important, the clearest example. It combines characteristics of Wernicke's aphasia, the high number of semantic anomalies, with characteristics of Broca's aphasia, poor performance on the measures of fluency, which is odd. It's not something that is intuitive from the point of view of a clinician, I think. Other profiles are a little more intuitive. So this is a non-fluent profile that combines better performing individuals with Broca's aphasia and transcortical motor aphasia. This profile looks like the lower performing individuals with Broca's aphasia, so lots of grammatical errors and lower scores on the fluency measures and grammatical complexity. This one looks very similar to the anomic profile. This one also looks like a cross between the anomic profile and those who are judged not aphasic by Western Aphasia Battery. This one looks similar to the Wernicke's profile, but not as severe. And the final one looks similar to the not aphasic by Webb profile, but better on the fluency and grammatical complexity measures. So to summarize, what this type of analysis seems to be doing is it's capturing some of the qualitative differences between syndromes, but also paying a lot more attention to quantitative differences in severity. Here's a look at who went into each of these profiles. And this is one of the ways that I used to decide what to call them. So the first one, for example, low Wernicke's, high Broca's, shows 16 individuals with Broca's aphasia, more than half, but also 4 individuals with Wernicke's aphasia. This is probably one of the clearest examples showing almost all individuals with Broca's aphasia and a few others. This is one of the least clear examples, which I call high Wernicke's, because there's a significant number of individuals with Wernicke's aphasia, but also almost equally divided amongst 3 other types. So the latent profiles that were generated by this analysis did not show a consistent relationship to subtype diagnosis. Each included at least 4 subtypes, and each aphasia subtype was represented in at least 3 of the profiles. And I think the reason is what I said earlier, is that it's paying much more attention to quantitative or severity differences. And these were verified by looking at what I called high and low BROCAs. I looked at their performance on WOG-AQ and some of the other measures, and they were significantly different. So to summarize all those different analyses, the exploratory factor analysis generated 6 factors that reflected both fluency, both at the phrase level and at the narrative level, grammatical accuracy and complexity, semantic accuracy, and repair behaviors. Those were the factors that distinguished amongst the syndromes, and accounted for 52% of the variance, which is quite a high number for a factor analysis, but it leaves open questions about the other 50% of the variance. What else contributes to patterns of spontaneous speech? And there are lots of possibilities, such as premorbid style, individual differences, both premorbid and in how they adapt to the stroke. The linear discriminant analyses generated correct subtype classifications for only about 60% of the speakers, and mismatches were similar to those shown by clinicians. And the latent profile analyses reflected both quantitative and qualitative variance in generating profiles, dividing several of the syndromes into higher and lower performing subsets. So the factor analysis did offer a glimpse into broad patterns of production in aphasia, but one of the things I take away from this is that the factors are just as prone to fuzziness as the traditional syndrome. So they're not really a solution to the problem of fuzzy boundaries between syndromes. The methods of generating a factor analysis are only as objective as are allowed by the selection of variables and participants that are included. So very dependent on number of subjects, type of subjects, number of variables, and type of variables that are included. And the statistical approaches that are used to look at classification are also sensitive to different sources of similarity and variation in clinicians, and the biggest difference being the influence of severity. So 2 things: the influence of severity, which was evident in the latent profile analysis, and the influence of the large groups, which was most evident in the linear discriminant analysis. So the solution of the linear discriminant analysis was very influenced by the high number of BROCAs and anomic aphasics in the group. So what this points to, in my mind, is the need to balance this kind of data-driven population-level analysis, which can only capture broad patterns, to more fine-grained individual analyses. And it also generated a lot of follow-up questions in terms of the individual differences within these different syndromes, and the role that might be played by different types of discourse and other types of variables that were not measured here. So lots of room for follow-up. Oops. Can't skip over my thank you slide. So many thanks to the ASHA Foundation whose funding contributed to this, and to the Aphasia Bank developers, administrators, and all those who contributed, including the clinician researchers and the patients who allowed their data to be stored there. Thank you to my mostly anonymous reviewers for JSLHR, and to Dr. Stark and Focus for inviting me. And if we have time, I would welcome questions.
Fantastic. I will let some of the questions roll in, but I just wanted to say huge thank you. I find this fascinating, as you know, and so I'm really glad you came to chat with us today. I guess I should turn my video on so you can see me. So I will let some people think of some questions, but I guess I'll kick one off just to get us kind of going here. One of the things I think is fascinating with treatment is measuring outcomes and kind of looking at what outcomes, would theoretically change with the treatment. And something I like about this factor analysis approach is you kind of come to the table with the idea that you do understand there's lots of interactions between microlinguistic variables and whatnot. Do you think, having this kind of a global overview can help us to, identify treatments maybe a little bit more clearly rather than basing them on kind of aphasia subtypes, just having that like idea of how things interact? I don't know if that's too global of a question, sorry.
It is a big question, but I have some ideas that have come out of this study and the two previous studies with Charisse Clough that relate to, so don't directly relate to the data that I showed you, but relate to the data that kind of emerged from this, and that has to do with the interaction. So one of the observations was that the impact of a given variable depends on syndrome and severity. Mm-hmm. So one example is, I actually do have a slide that illustrates this, kind of busy, but I did conduct some correlations of the factors across, these are the factors with certain variables individually for different subtypes. And the one thing I want to draw your attention to is the role of repair. So repair in some syndromes is positively related to narrative production. So this is for Broca's aphasia. But for Wernicke's aphasia, strongly negatively related. And what does that mean? So that means that if you can, well, your dog has an answer. If you can repair production, then that's really helpful to somebody who has very limited production to begin with. But if you do a lot of repairing, it's not productive for somebody who's already quite fluent. It actually reduces fluency. So the impact, another example was finding positive correlations between grammatical complexity, or MLU, and grammatical errors. So producing more speech or more connected speech actually created opportunities for more errors. And so there's not always a predictable relationship between good characteristics of spontaneous speech and bad characteristics of spontaneous speech. And so that has to be considered at a more micro level, either syndromes or levels of severity or individuals even. So what becomes important really depends on the profile of the individual.
Yeah, I always find repairs interesting because it's a level of self-awareness too, which can be, interesting. Right. I will stop taking all the question times. I'm sure there are others on here. So I know we have one in the chat. I don't know if you can see the chat, but I'm happy to read it out to you. Let's see. It says, as a linguist, I'm a little unfamiliar with types of tasks in the aphasia bank and therapy approaches. So forgive me if the question is off. Might the reformulation task be playing an important role? Like, would real life conversation be a better source? And would the categorization of types of aphasia benefit from also looking at how speech is co-constructed with interlocutors? I think I read that okay.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And conversation is really a completely different beast from narrative, I think. And that's a limitation of this study, is only considering those microlinguistic variables, not macrolinguistic variables, which would include types of interaction with a partner. Um, I intentionally chose the narrative, though, for the reason that it controls, to some extent, the content of the narrative. So if you're looking at conversation or even the personal narrative, as opposed to story retelling narrative, there's a lot more difference that can be introduced in terms of how much one says and the topics that one addresses. And I think that's going to introduce variability that makes it harder to compare across individuals. I'm not sure what the question about reformulation.
I think possibly like the role of maybe memory in terms of like semantics rather than episodic. I might be misinterpreting. I'll let Nick
Yeah,
know.
that's an interesting question about the role that memory might play. There were some individuals with aphasia, and I bet Davida can give more insight here, who seemed not to be able to perform the task because they didn't seem to be able to remember what happened in the picture book that they reviewed. So there's more going on there than.
All right, and maybe one
I see
final.
hands up.
Oh, here we go. Yeah.
Rachel Ostren, former student. Good to see you.
Hi.
Hi.
Blast from the past. Yeah, I actually had a question that was related to the one that was just asked, and was curious about even if you still do monologue speech, what you think about different types of spontaneous speech elicitation tasks. So retelling a story, or the cookie theft, like those are they're very structured because there's not much deviation, right? There is a limited number of things in the picture. There's, a limited number of events that happen in Cinderella. And so I wonder if you think, how you think that a more unstructured, just kind of open-ended question prompt, where would you like to travel or something like that, how that might work as a better way or as a different way of kind of separating different subtypes, because would that allow for more variability in terms of kind of types of responses or even specific and content responses? Just kind of what you think about that in terms of a different task.
Yeah, that's kind of hard to predict. That's an interesting idea, and there has been some research conducted mostly by Heather Wright and her colleagues on the role of different types of elicitation tasks. But it could be a way of enhancing distinctions between subtypes of aphasia, because some individuals with aphasia can take better advantage of the open-endedness of open-ended discourse. So they can work like individuals with anomic aphasia can work their way around word retrieval blocks by circumlocuting, and whereas individuals with Broca's aphasia have less ability to do that. So it's possible that it could, but I think for this, those are sources of variability that I was more wanting to factor out. I think they're very important ecologically, but I just kind of wanted to control them in this study.
Very reasonable. Thanks.
I think Dr. Fromm had a question. She raised her hand, so just wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Hi, Davida.
Hi. This is so great. And thank you so much for doing this work and then for explaining it so clearly, just laying it out in such a clear fashion, going through the various steps and processes that you did. Makes so much sense. And I think it's a really important thing that we need to sort out, and we now have some data with which to do that, and have interesting new statistical methodologies and things that we can apply, and I think it's a very exciting time for this kind of research, and I know it's an area that you've been looking into for a long time. I guess one of the things I just am curious about is how you feel tied to the syndromes when we're talking just about connected speech, because we do run into that issue with repetition and auditory comprehension being such integral parts of the syndrome definitions and the syndrome realities, perhaps, you know, if they are. And so if we're just talking about connected speech and specifically even microlinguistic aspects of connected speech, does it still make sense to hang on to like transcortical motor when that's really like a non-fluent with, you know, good repetition, and repetition's not relevant in connected speech, or, you know, with the auditory comprehension aspects? Is that a disconnect for you, or you just think we should forge ahead that way? Just wondering what your thoughts are about that as you know, were playing with your results and still relating them to high and low types.
Yeah, I mean, it's a limitation in a sense that it's sort of the only gold standard I have to try to understand what's going on, is to always go back to those syndrome labels and see how they correspond. I don't really know how to understand the categories that were generated without that. But it's also a limitation to only rely on spontaneous speech. I do think that spontaneous speech is the major source of variability. It's what's behind the fluent, non-fluent dimension, which of course, you know, I'm interested in that. I think it's a major contributor here. But it means that something like, we didn't have very many transcortical, and they were only transcortical motor. So I think they were fairly well accounted for, at least in the sense of capturing their non-fluency, but lack of, you know, agrammatism. But the conduction aphasia group was not well captured. I think that's probably because they're distinguished better by repetition. But one thing that was captured for conduction aphasia was the issue of repair. So and I think that some of the things that were captured here, and we've talked about this before, point to ways in which it would be helpful to come up with more fine-grained distinctions. So what kinds of repairs would be helpful to notice, to distinguish between conduction and anomic, which we're both high on that, and what kinds of grammatical errors would distinguish between agrammatism and paragrammatism, and things like that. So maybe it would do a better job if we could get more fine-grained, but of course you're right that the classical syndromes make use of the other auditory oral modalities as well, yeah.
It looks like we have one final chat question. I don't know if you can read that on your end.
Is it possible that the evidence pointed to Broca's as a default because the narrative does not include much auditory comprehension info? I think Broca's and anomic were identified as defaults because there were so many, and their characteristics on the spontaneous speech identified like those two broad patterns most clearly. If you mean not having auditory comprehension info would certainly make it difficult to distinguish between Broca's and global, if that's what you're thinking of. Any other questions? Great to see some former students here.
Thank you a lot. Sorry for the beagle.
Julianne, Charisse, Ari, hi.
Lots of people here. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. We'll put this on YouTube, and we'll send the link around as well. And sorry about the beagle interruption. She saw a squirrel, so important. Classic. But thanks so much. And if anyone has any further questions, I will relay them to you. But to everyone who's here, if you need a letter, please send me an email. My email should be in the chat. And if Dr. Gordon allows us, we might post her slides on the website too. We'll see. So thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
So.